Well, thank you, James. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, man, you got quite an interesting, well, you got quite a biography too, and quite an interesting biography, but you got quite a varied interest there. Like myself, Rick, I'm into all sorts. I've got fingers in all pies. I guess I think I'm an author myself, but I wouldn't write about them all, Rick, but I pick a genre to write, but I research them all, and I'm into everything. I mean, anything that's a mystery or ancient history. I think you're pretty much the same type of guy, Rick, yeah?
I think so, yes. And my contention is that it all intertwines anyway. So if you don't know enough about that part of the subject, go find someone who does.
Sure.
And that's part of what I do in the book is I cite those people who are more expert in those areas than I am. Because I can't outdo them, so I might as well, give credit where credit is due.
Beautiful. And you're from like an engineering background too, Rick. I guess tell me about your pre-authorship career. Tell us about the man, the engineer, the scientist. Because you obviously are a very analytical person. I'm a systems analyst in the engineering industry, and I like to think that this research that I do in history today is a systems analyst approach, just directed towards history as opposed to. So, do you feel your analytical behavior, all the engineering skills are still there, still being used?
They are, but in a much different way. I still work with the cartography quite a bit, obviously. When I worked in radar and some of the other disciplines, I guess, it was part of it, but it wasn't the main part. The main part was, the electronics and how you get the signal out and signal back and discern what the signal means. But only a little bit of it was devoted to where exactly is that signal going in 3D space. But that background has helped me in my current research, which is mentioned in the book, but I'm doing more research in that area, and that is a line of sight communication system that I believe, and I think I can prove, existed 1,000, maybe 2,000 years before Columbus. And I know it existed in Lower Britain as well as across the continent. And that's been proven by other folks, not by me. But the same or a very analogous system existed in North America, at least along the Ohio Valley and its tributaries. And I can prove that.
Wow. Awesome, Rick. Awesome. I guess, I guess you're very aware of the ancient history of the ancient maps of America from the Piri Reis, and obviously being a cartographer, you must be aware of all the ancient maps. That must be a line of research for you too, Rick.
It is, and Piri Reis's map is just the tip of the iceberg. There are dozens that are at least that old. In fact, quite a bit older. You have maps from the Roman era that hint at Western lands. You have narratives that hint at Western lands, but you don't have any de facto description of them, or it's this far away in this direction, or whatever. It says, the Antilles, or whatever it says. The Fortunate Isles in the case of Arthurian period.
Wow, I hadn't actually heard about any of the Roman maps. That's interesting, Rick. I know you got the Franco-Rossoli map and the Orontius Phineas and the Philip Wash map, and I guess they're probably the well-known ones, but what's your feeling on cartography? Do you think there was a high science long ago? And because it's quite a difficult. Let's just talk about cartography, Rick, before we get into some of the book.
Cartography and surveying are two different spokes of the same wheel, but they're both spokes of the same wheel that shares astronomy, astrology, and a number of other sciences, or at least endeavors. And you can go back to pre-Roman history, the legend of Pythias, or Pythias, depending on how you choose to pronounce it. And he was a Greek explorer who sailed from Marseille and sailed all the way around the British Isles, and in fact recorded the circumference of the British Isles to within 2% of present-day numbers. And yet, according to history, he could not have been using, the right kind of trigonometry to let that happen, and yet he did. He also described what he called sea lung, which is the froth ice around Iceland, where fog freezes on top of the ocean.
Wow. Wow.
So Pythias or Pythias was probably a real person who really did all the things he described, but he was decried by historians almost immediately. It's a myth. It's a legend. It couldn't possibly have happened. There's no place where water becomes solid, or anything like that, or that the land can spew forth hot rocks. Of course, St. Brendan said that too about Iceland. So there are tales from time immemorial of sailing across the North Atlantic, or at least to the North Atlantic. So why do we ignore them? And that's kind of what I'm trying to answer, is why do we ignore those tales, those histories, until they're decried by the formal historians? Is it a verbal tradition? Is it just a myth, or what is it? And I think the answer is no. I think some of them, at least, are real. You have, for instance, in 100 BC, you have the Antikythera device, which calculated the position of the planets absolutely perfectly and had 36 gears. It was a monument to engineering skills as well as actual mechanical fabrication, if you will. And although that particular example of the device no longer works because it spent 2,000 years underwater, it does indeed describe or imply a body of knowledge that we never before credited to those ancient people. And yet we have other examples of people doing virtually the same thing, but not with a little box that they had on the deck of their ship.
Sure. I'm glad you brought up the Antikythera mechanism. Wow. Just in engineering appreciation alone, for that time frame, Rick, to see a planetarium, effectively a planetarium, with epicyclic gearing and complex mechanisms, when they weren't even known to have made gears, it's just absolutely, for me as an engineer and a researcher, it's a dream to research that. I actually, would you believe, Rick, I have plans to build a replica. It's a project I'm working on with another engineer. We're going to build one. There is actually several people that have built it. You would obviously know this, Rick, having researched it, but Derek de Sola Price was the first guy who researched that, and
well, there are several different interpretations of it. Well,
yes.
even the number of gears, but like you say, the elliptical gears was a surprise to everybody.
Yeah, that was the bombshell, wasn't it? Oh, man,
yeah.
These guys were doing elliptical gears to mimic, the elliptical. I mean, they were able to mimic this, because the sun doesn't go around in a perfect circle, obviously.
Nor does the moon.
Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, I'll surely say the Earth goes around the sun in it's a slightly eccentrical orbit, and the moon as well. But they were able to accommodate that in that device, Rick, and that's what gets me. That's the punchline. There was actually a Dutch guy, in West Coast, America, did a replica of it. I think that's one of the best ones I've seen. But what was good about him is that he built a large scale replica of it so that everybody could see it working. He said it was harder to build it bigger than smaller, but he said these guys did something very, very crafty. They built it into a very condensed, compact box.
I agree. And the other comment that I believe that one came out of the Smithsonian itself, was that it wasn't a one-of-a-kind thing. These things were mass produced.
Yeah, this is the only one that survives, but I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, you can't, there's a body of knowledge there for that, Rick. And that's what I'm alluding to with this, where I'm going with this, yeah. I mean, there had to be a body of knowledge for these guys. They didn't just make one and get it right like that perfectly,
Right. And 200 years before that, or 250 years before that, you had this little known guy by the name of Archimedes, who could design and supervise the construction of ships that would carry 4,000 people, and did so. The ship was named the Syracusia, and it only made one voyage, according to history, from Syracuse to Alexandria. But it worked. He proved his point. You could build large ships. This is also the same guy who was stabbed by a Roman soldier while saying, "Do not disturb my circles." He was trying to figure out something like how to use or build an Antikythera device. And he was, the Battle of Syracuse. The Romans wrote the history of it, of course, because everybody else was dead.
He was still doing his math in the sand. That's how he was hardcore right to the end, Rick.
He was hardcore right to the end. Yes, he was. And there was a standing order. This is incidental, but for the conspiracy buffs, you'll love this. There was a standing order by the Roman legions not to kill Archimedes. And it was a written order because all Roman soldiers had to be able to read and write. They wanted him alive and they wanted his technology and engineering alive. But it didn't happen.
Yeah, somebody just jumped the post and got a bit trigger happy, or sword happy, I should say. So, Rick, this device was there back then. There was obviously evidence of ancient maps, which I've looked a lot at maps of the ancient sea kings by Charles Hapgood, and one of them, an excellent cartographer again, who worked with the American military as well, and you know, it's a very high science, and this is the thing for me. I didn't realize until I researched cartography, Rick, and now the gauntlet's laid down for me, just in terms of wanting answers. You know, I don't think I'm ever going to write a book about maps, but it's not my thing but definitely to research and read about. Yes, I don't think there's enough research being done into it, Rick.
I concur. There's so much more to learn, so many more bits of data that could contribute to it. If people start reading my book, and there are 3 or 4 chapters available online to read for free.
Oh, beautiful.
And I start out with the French colonial maps of America.
Yeah.
Because there are some anomalies in there.
Yeah.
And I concentrate on what is called the Delisle map. And Delisle was the French royal geographer. His job was to let the king know, or in that case, the king and his regent, or the king to be in the region, because the king was not yet of age, what France possessed, you know, all their possessions in the entire known world. Mm-hmm. So he described the then new colony of Louisiane, La Louisiane, and he did it in that period of French, but he made some clerical errors that a man of that level would not make unless it was intentional.
Sure.
For instance, he changed the capitalization on articles in places that there was no need, certainly, and in fact it was wrong according to the standard grammar, or I should say standard usage. He also had little things in there that don't show up in later maps, and they certainly don't show up in any history books. For instance, at the confluence of the Mississippi River and the Ohio River, he has the entry or legend, Ancien Fort. Ancien has several different meanings in modern French. It can mean anything from the previous paragraph to the former prime minister. But in that usage, it could only mean that there was an ancient fort there already. By 1716, it was already ancient.
Sure.
And yet it does show up again on the D'Anville map, another French cartographer. It shows up in a couple of English copies, but in the English copies, it's listed as Old French Fort, but the French never built a fort there. So
wow.
it gets really interesting, and in fact, it is during the period of time when France used what is called the Grand Cipher, one of the best ciphers ever devised by the mind of mankind, and it is not a letter substitution cipher. It's actually a numerical code that represents a syllable. So it's a syllabic cipher. And you'll have like a 1 to 4 digit numeral that represents a syllable. Mm-hmm. But where it gets really cute is each set can have its own key. So for instance, when Thomas Jefferson used it, mm-hmm. Because he was friends with Marquis de Lafayette, he had a different, I think, that he had a different key that he used with each different correspondent. And he may have actually had that committed to memory rather than to paper or, in that case, whatever. Because there's nothing has survived in his libraries that has been discovered so far that would represent a key to such a cipher. But we have other evidence that he transferred at least one key to Meriwether Lewis for the trip west. And Meriwether Lewis, of course, died in 1809 under very mysterious circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I can see your interest in cryptography now. I was wondering the interest in cryptography, but like, you know, I guess, Rick, you know, that time period, trade secrets were protected by what we might think as crude. Our cryptography now is all computerized. It's all, you know, heavy math and algorithms. But like, I mean, back in the day, like in the time we're talking about here, Rick, I mean, cryptography was old school. It was like what you're talking about, all these little ciphers and codes and stuff like. And they had trade secrets. They couldn't get the information out. Like, they didn't want it out. So this is what they did. This is like high science of today.
Yes, it is. It was one of the highest sciences of that time period. It certainly was one of the highest political sciences, because Jefferson gave instructions to Lewis, very specific instructions on how to convey information back to Jefferson while west of the Mississippi, and to use cipher if it would threaten the security of the United States.
Wow. So tell me the importance of this Delisle map then.
The Delisle map.
Sorry, yeah. Delisle, is it? I just...
Okay,
yeah.
so he was the royal cartographer. He was the cartographer to the court of France. And yet he made all these strange, enigmatic, and sometimes just downright wrong entries on the map. He mapped, for instance, lead mines in Iowa and in Illinois. But the French had just got there. So who was mining lead in those areas before the French got there? Yeah.
So, was there? What would have that been? Maybe a decoy, or these were like genuine maps, not as a decoy. These were like dedicated maps to show exactly that.
They were dedicated to the King of France. Yes, so this is your realm.
So there was no need for a decoy on it,
unless there was a danger of the map and its accompanying narrative being captured by other folks, other nations, or, you know, privateers, as the case may be. Because they were by 1716, they were already expecting it to go to war between Great Britain and France over the American colonies. And the Spanish weren't immune to it either. And nobody trusted anybody. Yeah. And that's kind of the core of the first 4 chapters, is what was the situation where he would draw this map this way. Well, I think part of it was that they wanted to keep the trade secret, certainly. These tribes are friendly to the Spanish. Don't even go there. These, you know, the English are here. This is our failed fort at Savannah, Georgia, or what became Georgia. Mm-hmm. And this is where there was already an ancient fort. Well, that's where it gets interesting, because if there was already an ancient fort, then somebody, and it was a stone fort, somebody with stone building skills understood the importance of that river confluence, because all of the trade traffic of basically a fourth of North America went past that point.
Wow.
Anything that was going to leave America pretty much had to go there. And it had existed for some great time before the French got there. It's not the only example, but it's a primary one. And it is at a place called Cairo, Illinois, spelled like Cairo, Egypt. Ah. And that end of Illinois is also called the Egyptian Hills, or Little Egypt. It's also the place where, I don't know if you talk to Scott much, you know about or are aware of the so-called Burroughs Cave stones. And that particular set of artifacts was found within that area called Little Egypt. So, are there still questions? Oh yeah, there's more questions than there are answers.
Yeah, let's just say for the audience and for me, I think who didn't discover America before the Columbus? I mean, there's so many wonderful, awesome, fascinating trails of evidence now, and they're not being answered, Rick. You know, so
Right.
I think definitely. I think there was definitely stuff there before. I like the way you take this though, and you work backwards though. You're taking what we know, the most recent period, and you're working back in time. So, I do just want to say that for the audience. I think there was definitely cases of, God, you know, how many cultures went there, like, you know, before the Spanish, French, and English, like, but
Well, and that's where it gets interesting. And I understand we're going to be taking a break here in just a couple minutes, but. In 2 minutes, let me summarize this. If there were a Christian culture in America before Columbus, then all the subsequent land claims by any government would be null and void under the papal bull that said, here you go, it's all yours. If there are no Christians, it's yours. Well, if there had already been Christians, then that did not apply to North America.
Sure.
So that's what I think the French and the English and the Spanish and the Americans were trying to keep secret from everybody, even though probably everybody already knew it.
Yeah, it was known. It was known in their circles.
Yeah.
Let's just pause it there, Rick, before we get into the land claims, because this is the key now that's going to kind of open up what we're going to talk about. This land grab that basically ensued. And what it means to have a land claim and the legislation surrounding that. I think this is the key to what we're going to talk about, and probably why, you know, things were covered up. And
agreed.
Sure. Okay, we'll be back in just a moment, Rick. We're going to take a quick tune, and we'll be back in just a minute. And we are back with your host, James Swagger, on Capricorn Radio. Don't forget, follow the YouTube channel on capricornradio.com. You can check out the live shows. You can check out the archives, the Facebook group, the Facebook page. And you can see what's going on with tours and events and from guests and authors. So, Rick, we're back. We're going to talk about the scramble for land in America and what it all means. Perhaps you're just going to tell us about the land grab that ensued and what it means and what the anomalies are, Steve.
Sure. Well, obviously, from an historical point of view, that is history as it's written and accepted, Columbus discovered America. That does not mean necessarily that he was the first to explore America from the old world. It just means that he did all the paperwork right.
Exactly. I like the way you put that.
And it was in accordance with a papal bull from 1452 that said, if you discover land that is not inhabited by Christians, then you can claim it and enslave all the non-Christians, which they proceeded to do. And subsequent colonization by Spain and Portugal and France and England and even Sweden and Russia all followed that papal bull. And just a few years ago, and it amounts to planting the flag of your country and a Christian flag and saying a prayer and invoking the power of God to claim that land as your own, as a Christian land. Well, just a few years back, Russia dropped a flag into the Arctic Ocean that was designed to stand upright. So they're claiming the Arctic Ocean. China dropped a flag into the ocean off Vietnam at the Spratly Islands and said they're ours. There's a lot of oil and gas in both those places. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's all about those natural resources, even the natural human resources. It's claiming it. We own it. But that papal bull had that clause, no Christians. In America, if some proof of a previous Christian colony or even just occupation for some period of time came to light, then all those previous claims could be questioned legally. And when I say legally, I mean it exactly as it sounds. In a United States Supreme Court case, Johnson versus McIntyre, and this is thanks to Robert J. Miller, who teaches law at Lewis and Clark College out in Oregon. And he is Native American descent, Shawnee. But his research indicated that this court case set the precedent for the United States to be the exclusive buyer of all land in what is the United States. Sure. In other words, a private citizen, in this case Johnson, could not buy land directly from the Native Americans. land could only be sold directly to the government, who would then dispense it to non-Native Americans. And McIntyre had bought his land claim from the government. Johnson's ancestor had bought the land from the Piankashaw tribe directly. And it just didn't hold water according to the Supreme Court. So McIntyre ended up with the land. And that was a seminal court case that established the United States as the sole buyer, sole person, sole entity to deal with Native Americans. Nobody told the Native Americans, apparently. But if you go back in time, even in that part, and that was in Illinois, incidentally, if you go back in time, there are a number of artifacts, linguistic indications, large-scale construction. When I say large-scale, it stretches entirely across the state of Illinois, from Cahokia to very near where I live here in Indiana. And it is a series of stone walls and stone fortifications. Somebody was sealing off the bottom part of Indiana and Illinois to the Ohio and or Mississippi rivers.
Wow.
And that ancient fort that was on a Delisle map would fall in that area.
Right.
That would have been like the big one. That would have been like the Alexandria or Cairo, because that's what it's called, of the modern era in North America. So you got all the legal precedent is in place that says, you know, if that evidence exists, and we're pretty sure it does, then the government of the United States could be in a pickle because they don't have a leg to stand on. It goes back to the very source seminal document, the Papal Bull. If there were already Christians here, the government can't make that claim stick.
Wow,
so
it's a real mess, isn't it? It's a real mess.
Yeah.
This is the cover of all cover-ups then, Rick.
It is. And we were talking during break. I'm giving a talk out in Utah next week for the conference, 12th Semi-Annual International Book of Mormon Evidence Conference. Well, I'm not Mormon. I'm only interested in what happened.
Yeah.
And why it happened that way. But the Mormons got drug into it because Joseph Smith said, okay, this is written evidence, meaning the golden plates, that Israelites came to North America. Okay, well, that by itself would not negate the land claim of the United States under the Papal Bull, because they were Israelites. They were not Christians. They would not be Christians for another 2,600 years. However, if you admit that anybody could sail across the ocean and establish a colony, then it opened the door for later claims, Christian-era claims. Everybody from Prince Madoc and King Arthur to the Ninth Roman Legion, which is kind of where I went with my book. By the way, the Ninth Roman Legion, for those who do not know, were stationed in Britain for most of their career, which spanned from 64 BC up to 117 AD, where they promptly disappear from history. There's not an order disbanding them. There's not an account of their being annihilated in battle or absorbed by other legions. They simply ceased to exist in history.
Disappeared in a way, Rick. They just went off the grid.
They went off the grid in a very real way, except for one particular officer. His name was Lucius Aemilius Carus. And in 142 AD, he was appointed the governor of Arabia Petraeus, what we know as the city of Petra. And that was a captured land under Hadrian, who came to power in 122. Built Hadrian's Wall. I
was just going to say, I've had the pleasure to walk the whole length of Hadrian's Wall. I lived in Carlisle at the time, and it's just south of Lockerbie. If everybody knows Lockerbie for the plane crash, but just in between, Lockerbie's on the Scotland side, Carlisle's on the English side, and Hadrian Wall's run in between it, and it just basically splits the whole of Britain in two, and it's it's the narrowest point. It's about 80 miles, and Hadrian built the wall to basically keep the Scots out. He wanted to keep the Romans in.
He wanted to keep them under control.
Yeah.
He didn't want to keep them out because he still wanted the trade goods.
Yeah.
And they taxed anything that went through the gates of that wall. That was the whole thing. It wasn't a military operation. As a military design, it sucks. But as a civic control design,
exactly,
it is genius.
Yeah.
And so was the city of Petra, except that you didn't have to build anything because it's a natural toll booth.
Yeah, it's carved into living rock, Rick.
Exactly. As would be, say, the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi River.
And it's famous for the Indiana Jones movie as well. It's in it's the rock temple that's carved into the rock in Petra in Jordan, for anybody who's listening.
Yeah, the search for the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
Which kind of enters into the next part of this, which is
beautiful.
Prince Madoc. A lot of people are aware of the legend of Prince Madoc. In my region of North America, we're very aware because of an ancient fortress that once existed along the Ohio River on the Indiana side, directly across from Louisville, Kentucky. It's called 14 Mile Island. It's also called Rose Island. But it's known locally as the Devil's Backbone because it's a high, narrow ridge on top. And in 1869 through 73, it was investigated by the Indiana geologist. His name was Edward T. Cox, and his assistant, contract assistant, I might add, named William Borden, and they surveyed this ancient fortress. It had first been mentioned, it first appears in the literature in 1799 in a letter from George Rogers Clark, who was a brigadier general in the U.S. Army. He is the guy who captured Fort Sackville from the English with 199 troops, wading about 13 miles through freezing waters, and he never did walk right after that. But anyway, he would know a fortress when he saw one. That's the main point.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So he mentioned it as a fortress, an ancient stone fortress. It's not the only one he encountered either. There was another one at present-day Merrim, Indiana, Merrim Bluff, which is, it is between Vincennes, Indiana, not Vincennes, sorry, and Terre Haute, Indiana. Very French name, Terre Haute. But it is a 120-foot high bluff above the river. And it had a stone fortress on it, stone and soil, as well as palisades. It was actually a 3-tiered fortification. This was very well engineered. And Clark would have seen that in 1787 because of a mission he was on to protect Vincennes from a raid by the Kickapoo Indians. At any rate, he knew stone fortifications when he saw them, and that's how he describes the Devil's Backbone. Well, by 1895, the railroads were going throughout North America, and they needed a lot of stone to build the upright piers across the Ohio River to put a railroad bridge in called the Big Four Railroad that goes from Indiana into Kentucky, into Louisville, Jeffersonville, Indiana. And they took the stone from that fortress to build those uprights. And the map that was made in 1873 by William Borden shows exactly where the stone was, describes it in pretty good detail. It was 10 to 12 feet high, and if you take all his measurements and coordinate it with the current topographical data of that place, then it had to be something between 500 and 600 feet long and about 20 foot wide, or thick, if you will. It was big enough, it had mounds on top of it.
Wow.
So and that was in 1895 when they built the bridge. In 1902, the Bureau of Ethnology, which was directed by one John Wesley Powell, dispatched a guy by the name of William Falk to go investigate this site, and the report came back that was published as scientific a priori data that we think this Borden and Cox were idiots because this is obviously quarried out stone. So you go back and examine the history, and yes, the Big Four Railroad did establish a quarry on top of Devil's Backbone.
Mm-hmm.
However, when you calculate the amount of stone that's in those uprights, those pillars,
sure,
versus what came out of that quarry, it won't build one of 7. So the stone that was quarried was already cut, and it was the fortress that they tore down. And when you go look at the stones in that, and that bridge still stands, by the way.
Which is most likely why they used that quarry. If there was already an existing quarry there, and they went, oh, right, this is a great place to be quarrying stone. Let's use this. So
yeah, they didn't have to quarry it out of the ground, though, because it was already cut and stacked for them. All they had to do was convey it. It was a giant, it was 600 foot long, 20 foot thick, 12 foot high wall with several openings, 4 openings. And the rest of the Devil's Backbone was, almost all of it, was protected by natural cliffs. You couldn't climb up it with rock climbing gear in a lot of cases. And then where there was a gap on the northwest side, they filled that in with a piece of wall that was 75 feet tall.
Wow.
So whoever it was that built that thing was very adept at stone masonry. Now, as to who built it, that's where the question comes in.
That's the big one, isn't it?
That is the big one. Who, what, when, where, why, how much, how often, how long. Those are my core questions.
But sometimes, Rick, it's even getting that question, getting people to realize there's a question there, Rick, is sometimes you kind of go, wake up, people, come on, there's a question that needs answering here. Some people don't even get to the question, never mind what the answer is.
So in 1902, the same guy, John Wesley Powell, dispatched William Falk to go look at it, and it was then in literature. Now, fast forward to 2009, 10, when I'm doing the research for this book, and I go to the U.S. Geological Survey topographical map of that piece of property. And it says very clearly, historic fort ruins. But it's pointing at the quarry that's up on top, not where Borden and Cox placed it at the bottom of the bluff.
Wow.
So they got into the literature that there never was a really big, sophisticated fort there. No. It's just this little piece of wall that's actually a quarry. Well, that's so completely wrong. And yet, when you go look at who was the director of the USGS and the director of the Bureau of Ethnicity at the Smithsonian, at the same time, that was the same John Wesley Powell. Now, this is where it gets really interesting for the conspiracy buffs. John Wesley Powell never graduated from college. He attended college, Oberlin College, Illinois College, but he never graduated from college, and yet he became the director of ethnology for the Bureau, for the Smithsonian Institution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is a guy who came out of Illinois, who was born in upstate New York in 1834. His father was an itinerant minister, preacher of English extraction, and he was a Methodist, but he was in upstate New York in 1830, the same year that Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon. And all the parishioners from his little Methodist church became Mormon. And he never, ever got over it. And he dragged his son through western New York, sons, plural, but mostly John Wesley, who we're talking about, into Ohio, skipped over Indiana, and settled in Illinois, basically trying to follow the Mormons and get the parishioners back. So John Wesley Powell was raised with this attitude that the Mormons are evil. We must save our parishioners from the Mormons. And he never ever forgot that. But it gets back to if there were ever records found with any kind of writing on them that would indicate a lost tribe of Israel or anybody else, then now we know that somebody could cross an ocean and establish a colony. If they could do it after 33 AD, And before 1492, then all the land claims go out the window.
Sure. Okay, so Rick, this land grab and what it means to take control, I mean, I think their own paperwork beat them in a way, Rick.
Well, yes and no. For the French map, let's get back to the Delisle map for just a minute.
Sure.
There are a couple of anomalies in the map that line up with sets of digits across the top of the map which do not reflect longitude. Not any system that I recognize of longitude, which is really strange from a geographer. At any rate, I think it may be part of that grand cipher within this map. And there are other things. But you can see what I wrote about that in those sample chapters that are available.
Sure.
But it all comes back to what did they know and when did they know it? And by 1716, I'm pretty sure that the royal geographer of France knew it. That there had been somebody in North America before them who were Christians.
Yeah,
so, was it Prince Madoc? Prince Madoc, I know we're coming up to a break. Prince Madoc, there are two different legends within Wales of Prince Madoc. One of them places him in 1170 AD. The other one places him in roughly 570 AD as sailing to America. The earlier version, as researched by William Blackett and, by Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett, places Prince Madoc as a half-brother to the king and admiral of the Welsh fleet. Backtrack just a little bit. When Julius Caesar tried to invade Wales, he met 700 ships assembled over 2 days. He made it out alive, so he considered it a victory. But while he was there, he discussed the writing system that they used, and he called it some kind of a ancient Greek. Skip forward to 570 AD, and there was some kind of an extraterrestrial impact event that ruined the crops for a decade in Great Britain. And that one's not in question by conventional scientists.
Sure.
So whoever was king at that time would have gathered as many people as he could and found a place to take them to survive, or at least find some way to get trade goods in. Well, after a decade, Prince Madoc, Admiral Madoc, had actually been blown west by this same event. Most of his fleet was destroyed, but he was able to reassemble and come home after a decade. Just happened to show up at the time when King, his brother, half-brother, is trying to assemble this force of colonists, or whatever he's got to do to keep the kingdom alive. So they built ships, and they moved everybody to North America in about 570 AD. In 572 or so, they had an incident with the natives in which the king was killed, and his body was put into a cave to desiccate. This is according to Wilson and Blackett's interpretation of the ancient records. Chronicles of Wales. Anyway, King Arthur was actually real, according to them. In fact, there were two individuals named King Arthur. So, I guess we can talk about that when we come back from break.
Sure. Here's the thing, I think the systematic outlay of evidence that you have, Rick, is beautiful. I love the book. Yeah, the book is just a very analytical, well laid out, well structured choreograph of really what we know, what we don't know, what that means. And you're working back to this web of either lies, cover-up, or misinformation, disinformation.
All the above.
All of the above. Yeah, and it's a wonderful to see. And some of it I've been aware of, and some of it I haven't, Rick, and you're definitely bringing something new to the table.
Well, thank you, James. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, man. You got quite an interesting, well, you got quite a biography too, and quite an interesting biography, but you got quite a varied interest there. Like myself, Rick, I'm into all sorts. I've got fingers in all pies. I guess, I think I'm an author myself, but I wouldn't write about them all, Rick, but, I pick a genre to write, but I research them all, and I'm into everything. I mean, anything that's a mystery or ancient history. I think you're pretty much the same type of guy, Rick, yeah?
I think so, yes. And my contention is that it all intertwines anyway. So if you don't know enough about that part of the subject, go find someone who does.
Sure.
And that's part of what I do in the book, is I cite those people who are more expert in those areas than I am. Because I can't outdo them, so I might as well. And I know it existed in Lower Britain as well as across the continent. And that's been proven by other folks, not by me. But the same or a very analogous system existed in North America, at least along the Ohio Valley and its tributaries. And I can prove that.
Wow. Awesome, Rick. Awesome. I guess, yeah, you know, I guess you're very aware of the ancient history of the ancient maps of America from the Piri Reis, and obviously being a cartographer, you must be aware of all the ancient maps. That must be a line of research for you too, Rick.
It is, and Piri Reis's map is just the tip of the iceberg. There are dozens that are at least that old. In fact, quite a bit older. You have maps from the Roman era that hint at Western lands. You have narratives that hint at Western lands, but you don't have any de facto description of them, or it's this far away in this direction, or whatever. It says, the Antilles, or whatever it says. The Fortunate Isles in the case of Arthurian period.
Wow, I hadn't actually heard about any of the Roman maps. That's interesting, Rick. I know you got the Franco Rossoli map and the Orontius Phineas and the Philip Wash map, and I guess they're probably the well-known ones, but what's your feeling on cartography? Do you think there was a high science long ago? And because it's quite a difficult. Let's just talk about cartography, Rick, before we get into some of the book. It's quite
cartography and surveying are two different spokes of the same wheel, but they're both spokes of the same wheel that shares astronomy, astrology, and a number of other sciences, or at least endeavors. And you can go back to pre-Roman history, the legend of Pytheas, or Pythias, depending on how you choose to pronounce it. And he was a Greek explorer who sailed from Marseille and sailed all the way around the British Isles, and in fact recorded the circumference of the British Isles to within 2% of present-day numbers. And yet, according to history, he could not have been using, the right kind of trigonometry to let that happen, and yet he did. He also described what he called sea lung, which is the froth ice around Iceland, where fog freezes on top of the ocean.
Wow.
So Pythias or Pythias was probably a real person who really did all the things he described, but he was decried by historians almost immediately. It's a myth, it's a legend, it couldn't possibly have happened. There's no place where water becomes solid, or anything like that, or that the land can spew forth hot rocks. Of course, St. Brendan said that too about Iceland. So there are tales from time immemorial of sailing across the North Atlantic, or at least to the North Atlantic. So why do we ignore them? And that's kind of what I'm trying to answer, is why do we ignore those tales, those histories, until they're decried by the formal historians? Is it a verbal tradition? Is it just a myth, or what is it? And I think the answer is no. I think some of them, at least, are real. You have, for instance, in 100 BC, you have the Antikythera device, which calculated the position of the planets absolutely perfectly and had 36 gears. It was a monument to engineering skills as well as actual mechanical fabrication, if you will. And although that particular example of the device no longer works because it spent 2,000 years underwater, it does indeed describe or give credit where credit is due.
Beautiful. And you're from like an engineering background too, Rick. I guess tell me about your pre-authorship career. Tell us about the man, the engineer, the scientist, because you obviously are a very analytical person. I'm a systems analyst in the engineering industry, and I like to think that this research that I do in history today is a systems analyst approach just directed towards history as opposed to... So do you feel your analytical behavior, all the engineering skills are still there, still being used?
They are, but in a much different way. I still work with the cartography quite a bit, obviously. When I worked in radar and some of the other disciplines, I guess, it was part of it, but it wasn't the main part. The main part was, the electronics and how you get the signal out and the signal back and discern what the signal means. But only a little bit of it was devoted to where exactly is that signal going in 3D space. But that background has helped me in my current research, which is mentioned in the book, but I'm doing more research in that area, and that is a line of sight communication system that I believe, and I think I can prove, existed 1,000, maybe 2,000 years before Columbus.